Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 141. Vigilante Justicing 101. Back to the Basics. Izuku was kind of glad that he didn't have the mental bandwidth to be sick right now, because if he had a split second to stop and actually take in his surroundings, he's sure there would be bile churning in his gut. There was so much blood, human and otherwise, spilled in the streets, and he was hacking apart these monsters with the ferocity that he didn't know that he had in him. It seemed as though they all had regenerative capabilities to some degree, but the other quirks they had varied wildly, meaning that each fight was different. Thankfully, they all had the same weakness: the brain. Regeneration couldn't heal if there wasn't something to prompt it to do so. A handful of heroes ended up in the same plaza, and a moment of quiet passed over them while they waited for the next scream to sound out. It was in that interim that Izuku heard the sentence that shifted his focus entirely. "Where's Tenya?" He hoped beyond hope that he had heard that wrong, but when he whipped his head around, there was Manuel. He looked around in every direction, and Ida was nowhere to be seen. That damn freaking idiot! Izuku was gone in a flash of zigzagging green across the rooftops before he could even stop to think about what he was doing. On the topic of incredibly stupid decisions, Izuku had a feeling that even if this ended well, it wasn't going to end well. He had gone rogue. He was technically on patrol. He technically had permission to intervene in incidents, but he certainly didn't have the clearance to run off on his own. The situation was litigiously charged at best and downright illegal at worst. He had the All Might pin May made in one of the storage pouches on his belt. He should record everything. No one else knew about it. Either it could exonerate him in court, or he could delete it. It would either help or make no difference, so the decision was pretty obvious. He clipped it to his collar as he ran. The city passed by around him in a blur. He helped evacuate citizens only when strictly necessary, i.e., when a smoldering chunk of a balcony almost fell on two women trying to escape a burning building. Other heroes were working on evacuation, but no one else knew where Ida was. Well, shit. No one else knew where Ida was, meaning no one else knew where he was either. He doubted anyone would find the time to check their phone in the middle of this shit show, but he started sharing his location with Vernon and Shoto regardless. Something was better than nothing. After several tense minutes of him zipping across rooftops, something that was much easier when using One for All, he spotted exactly what he feared he would. Ida was on the ground, unmoving, as a masked figure stood above him, sword poised to cut his throat. The alley moved around him before he even realized he had lunged forward. The sole of his foot connected with the hero killer's chest with a crack, and the man rolled back violently, bouncing off the pavement every few feet until his back hit the far wall. That was way harder than he should have hit someone without a regeneration quirk, but he didn't really have the empathy to care. Somehow, he was still conscious, but he was dazed enough for him to check on Ida. Shit, there was another hero here too. Midoriya, how? Ida looked up at him with his eyes, but otherwise remained completely still. Paralysis was one of the quirk theories posited online about the hero killer. The few surviving witnesses had alluded to that in their statements, and it made sense. It's not easy to take out a drained hero. So Stain had to have some sort of trick to keep them from fighting back. Injuries. He interrupted Ida's confused questioning none too kindly. Get out of here. This doesn't have anything to do with you, Ida. Injuries. Now. He repeated in a tone that left little room for argument. He stabbed my shoulder, and now I can't move, he admitted shamefully. So it's likely activated by blood somehow. All right, That complicates things. Izuku could see about a dozen knives Stain had stored in various places on his person, and that wasn't even to mention the spikes on his clothing, namely the boots. Okay, just don't get hit then. Easy. You showed up to save your friend's life. You even made a big entrance, but I have a duty to kill him, and this so-called pro, a duty? Izuku, in his blind panic and rage, found himself interrupting the hero killer, Stain, mid-monologue, with an indignant sneer. All right, looks like everyone is staying firmly on the track of making incredibly stupid decisions tonight. Izuku needed to keep him yapping. He needed backup. If one nick in this fight meant him going down, then all three of them were as good as dead. That's why Stain always singled heroes out before killing them. Could he win this fight on his own? Possibly. But he didn't like his chances. If he could cut Ida in full armor, then Izuku's lightweight guards weren't likely to be of much use. Fear rose sharply in his chest as Stain got to his feet. Yes, child, a duty. This country is rife with false heroes, those who take up the mantle but know nothing of honor, motivated solely by money, fame, and glory. It is my purpose to purge them, so step aside or get culled, Stain proclaimed in a nauseatingly self-righteous tone. That was a crap argument if he ever heard one. Stain was probably used to monologuing to his victims, wasn't he? A real captive audience. Maybe he could bait him into a debate. He was already glaring at him with murder in his eyes, so it wasn't like it was going to make the situation any worse. Who gave you the right to play God? He asked, lacing his tone with as much false confidence as he could muster. You impudent little brat. He's a kid. And you're going to kill him over one bad decision? He challenged before Stain lost himself to blind rage. It was a decision born from an already corrupted mind. He tried to insist through gritted teeth. No, it was born from traumatized child who you forced to watch his brother's life get destroyed. Izuku spat right back. There is a rot in his brain that has already taken root. I don't expect you to understand that yet. I can only hope you learn the truth in time, and our paths do not cross again. I will not give you another warning. Step aside, boy. The hero killer strained the words through gritted teeth. Stain was close enough now for Izuku to see his eye twitch in anger. The scared child in him said that he needed to step down and mind his business before some other kid's beat down became his instead. But he had never been very good at listening to that voice, so he held his ground. What rot! The idea that he has the right to take justice into his own hands and cast final judgment without opposition sounds familiar, actually. He challenged again, and by some act of God, his voice did not waver. Normally, the anger fading from an opponent's face would be a good thing, but the fact that it was replaced with a wolfish grin accompanied by a depraved laugh kind of harshed the mellow a bit. The sound echoing off the walls of the alley made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Of course, you would hardly be a hero if you left now, would you? Stain pointed out, his voice tinged with a sweetness that betrayed the situation they were currently in. He raised his sword and let his feet settle into a fighting stance. He had no clue how Stain fought. All he had were logical guesses at best. Izuku was well and truly scared. He felt like he was being stalked by a cat who liked to play with its food. A plan. He needed a plan. Like music to Izuku's ears, he heard the familiar crackling sound of Shoto's ice approaching from the mouth of the alley. No more cat and mouse. Now was his chance. He needed to time this right. The moment Stain noticed the newcomer, he would strike. A split second of distraction was all he needed. Shoto was far more suited for long-range attacks. If Izuku could throw him off his rhythm and he came in before Stain could reorient himself, that might be enough. He hoped it would be enough. There was no time like the present to find out. The instant there was a flash of recognition in his eyes, Izuku charged. Stain was much faster than he would have thought possible. He was poised to strike by the time Izuku made it to him, which was a fraction of a second. His katana was wickedly sharp. Izuku could tell because of how close it was to his face, which, needless to say, was far too close for comfort. He had no choice but to dodge. He ducked down, only to be greeted by a knife that his opponent had been wielding with his other hand. The detached, analytical side of his mind, that was not as terrified by the situation as it should have been, thought of how he wished Stain could teach him how to use blades like that. He quickly filed that frankly psychotic musing away and did his best to focus on not getting stabbed in the face. Izuku was already out of his line of sight. This was a blind stab, a well-aimed one, but blind nonetheless. His view was blocked by the other arm, which was still swinging forward from his first attempt to cut him. Izuku grabbed his knife from its holster on his hip, using his forearm bracer to deflect Stain's blade and let the cool steel of his own weapon glide its way across his opponent's knuckles. He continued his dodge, rolled straight between Stain's legs, and immediately leapt out of the way in preparation for Shoto's strike. A comforting chill and the creaking sound of ice shot toward them, so Izuku turned himself around like a cat in midair to see what was happening below. Stain had jumped with him and, to Izuku's horror, was holding a pair of throwing knives aimed at Shoto. He reacted as quickly as he could, but the knives had left Stain's grasp before Izuku could stop him. A solid punch sent Stain falling hard onto the jagged ice below, and he was not in good shape after that. Even still, he managed to dodge out of the way before gravity brought Izuku down for a second hit. The ice shattered around the impact, and the resulting debris blocked his line of sight. That split second of cover was enough. Izuku felt a sharp line of pain against his bicep. He whirled around as fast as he could to see one of the more off-putting things he had ever witnessed in a fight. Stain had unleashed a freakishly long tongue from his mouth, and it was moving to lick the blade that had just cut Izuku's arm. That was probably part of his quirk. He had to consume blood to paralyze. That would make sense, seeing as though Izuku was still moving right now. He threw one of his knives into Stain's hand, and it nestled itself cleanly between his bones and straight through to his palm, forcing the hilt of the weapon out of his hand and onto the ground. All right, with both of his hands pretty much out of commission, this should be an easy fight. Or it would be, if he could move. Damn, he was too late. He was stuck in place, stood between Stain and the rest of the alley's occupants. He hadn't gotten the chance to see if Shoto was okay after Stain had thrown his knives. He couldn't turn to see now, and he wasn't sure if the lack of action was due to Izuku being in the way of any attack Shoto might send towards Stain, or if the silence was due to injury. You've got fight in you, kid. It'd be a shame to see that drive go to waste. Stay put while I deal with these phonies. Stain cooed at him in a mocking tone as he walked past Izuku and out of his line of sight. The following moments were the longest of his life. From the sound of it, Shoto was still fighting, but Izuku had no way of knowing what was going on. He heard a few cries of pain, and each time he feared the worst, but he could still feel the heat of fire behind him, and shards of ice periodically danced across the alley's floor. He was pleading with his body to just move, and to his elated bewilderment, it did. It was sluggish at first, but he pushed through the strange feeling of lethargy. Was there a limit to how many people he could paralyze at a time? Did it become less effective the more people he used it on? Did different blood types not react the same as others? Whatever the answer was to why he could move now, he decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth. He turned around to see that Stain had yet to make his way to Shoto and the others, or at least he had been sent back if he had. Shoto had 2 knives sticking out of his right forearm and 1 in his left thigh. He shouldn't be moving. It was only going to cause more damage, but it's not like he had another choice. No more blood was going to be spilled tonight, at least not by Stain's hand. He was surrounded, and Izuku once again had the element of surprise. He wasn't going to let him hurt his friends again. Stain was charging at Shoto, sword drawn, and he was fast, but he wasn't as fast as Izuku. With speed that he had only the loosest control over, Jade charged forward. He grabbed at the loose strands of ratty cloth that flowed behind Stain as he ran and pulled hard. Seeing as though one of the cloths was connected to the crude mask he wore, Stain stopped fast, his head whipping back as the rest of his body continued forward with his momentum. He tried to move his knife up to cut himself free from Jade's hold, but Eraser pulled that move on him before on the few occasions he had been able to use his capture scarf against him in one of their spars, so he saw that coming. He kicked the weapon out of Stain's hand and kept pulling him closer. There was a fury in the man's eyes now that wasn't there before, one that might have worried him if his face wasn't approaching Jade's fist with frightening speed. Stain staggered back from the impact, and that moment of fumbling was enough for Shoto to freeze his feet down, causing him to stumble and fall backward. His head bounced off the pavement, and he lay still after that. Shoto looked more than a little bit horrified, but Izuku wasted no time stepping forward and stripping the weapons off his limp form. Once the most easily accessible were taken care of, he flipped him onto his stomach and stripped the wraps from his arms. They were going to need those. He used the strips of cloth he had grabbed earlier to bind Stain's wrists behind his back. Only once he was satisfied with the restraints did he check for a pulse. He's alive, he assured Shoto before resuming his task of checking for concealed blades. The amount of knives he pulled off of him was genuinely comical, and if some of them made their way into Izuku's pockets, well, that was for him to know and no one to find out. By the end of it, there was a pile of knives that put his old corkboard to shame, plus one pair of spiky boots. He added the laces from the boots to the cloths tying his wrists because the fabric looked far too tattered and easy to rip. He was not taking chances with this lunatic. By the time he finished his task, Ida was beginning to stir. Izuku didn't say anything to him, though. Shoto was still losing a lot of blood on second glance. They both were. Native, the other pro that was in the alley, still seemed to be stuck in place, but Izuku didn't see any dire injuries, so he kept his focus on his friends. Ideally, he would have them sit still until an ambulance arrived, but given the state that the city was in, he didn't think that was going to be soon enough. They at least needed to get out of the alley into somewhere they could be picked up. Native, I need your wraps, he informed the hero rather than asking. He walked over and unwound the seemingly decorative wraps from his lower legs. There was a good patch of blood on his left shoulder, but it wasn't spreading much, so it wasn't a priority. Izuku barely acknowledged the clearance to use part of his costume as he rushed back to his friends. Ida still had blood spilling down his arm, and the pool on the alley floor was far too big for comfort, so he set about tending to him first. He ignored any complaints with a sharp glare and did not warn him that a splash of alcohol was going to hurt. Sure, it was petty, but he was pissed. He pressed some gauze to the wound and bound it tightly with one of the strips of cloth he had taken. He repeated the process with Shoto, leaving the knives in his arm, but taking the one in his leg out. It was an ill-advised choice in most situations, but they were still under threat of attack, and if they needed to move, leaving the blade in his leg was only going to hurt him more. Worst comes to worst, he could cauterize the wound himself if bleeding out became a real threat. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. Native was moving by the time Izuku got to him, and he helped take care of his own first aid as best he could. The chaos of the inner city was still raging on, but it was distant. They could probably risk getting out of the limited cover of the alley if it meant help would be able to locate them. The alley would have been accessible, but the fight had rendered it a bit rugged. There probably wasn't much permanent damage, but the ice was too uneven for anything but an off-road vehicle to drive on. Native, help Shoto. We need to get somewhere an ambulance can access, he instructed as he hauled Stain's limp form over his shoulder. gosh, she was heavy. He was lean, but built like a brick. Izuku certainly wouldn't be carrying him with such ease if it hadn't been for One for All. Kid, your arm. Native tried to argue. It's fine. I'm not going to bleed out. He dismissed as he held his phone between his unoccupied shoulder and cheek to call for the police and an ambulance. As was to be expected, there was a wait for ambulances. He felt his skin crawl, having to just sit and wait while the rest of the city went up in flames. But if something happened and he wasn't here, well, this little troop wasn't in great shape to defend themselves. What the hell were you two idiots thinking? A familiar grating voice called out from above. Ah, Vernon. Seems like she got around to checking her phone. She darted down toward them, and Izuku had the feeling he was about to get grabbed by the ear so she could yell directly into it. Thankfully, Stain's body was currently blocking that avenue of attack. Upon noticing that, her focus shifted, and the look of anger on her face morphed into wide-eyed shock. Is that the damn hero killer? She asked incredulously as she touched down. Yes, I've already called for police and an ambulance, he replied, hoping that talking business would put off the inevitable berating he was about to receive. Jeez, kid, put him down. You're bleeding, she instructed. I know. It's the least of the injuries. Shoto has 3 relatively small and shallow stab wounds. Ida has a rough and large stab wound in the shoulder, and Native does as well, though it's not as bad as Ida's, he reported clinically, dropping the hero killer to the pavement outside of the alley none too gently. Do you have quirk-canceling cuffs? He spoke again when she didn't answer. He should probably have asked Native that, though he probably would have offered them if he had them. The look that crossed Vernon's face was almost identical to the one Eraser gave him every time he did something stupid as Ivy, a mixture of impressed disbelief and unspeakable irritation. It was almost reassuring. She took a moment to close her eyes and take a deep breath before answering. Yes, I do, she replied, and reached behind her belt to grab them. As she knelt down to fasten the cuffs in place, a sharp pain and a sense of dread pierced through Izuku's brain. Before he could even do anything about it, another, more tangible, piercing pain shot through both his side and his ears. The unmistakable shriek of a Nomu rattled his skull, and an awful pressure enveloped his torso as the ground grew further and further away from him. A set of wicked talons had grabbed him, and a winged Nomu was ferrying him away. He was already up too high to survive the fall, but it's not like he had much of a choice here. He had to fight back. He stabbed and slashed at the thing's ankles wildly, and all of a sudden, it just stopped. It froze in place, its claws still stuck around Izuku's torso, but it stopped flapping its wings, and the ground was once again fast approaching. Vernon was at his side in a second, but there was only so much she could do to hold him and the hulking mass of a Nomu suspended. She slowed their descent, but not enough. He was trying to pry its claws off of him, but it was getting difficult to breathe, and panic was starting to set in. His vision was getting cloudy, and the last thing he remembered seeing with full clarity was a great big glacier rising up to meet him as the ground barreled toward the 3 of them. Tenya felt sick. The blotches of red blooming out from the bandages covering Todoroki's injuries were stains that would never wash out from his own hands. Midoriya would hardly even look at him, and Tenya didn't blame him for a second. He would never be half the hero that either of them were already. Stain was right about him. He should have died in that alley. He didn't deserve to walk among his peers. He kept his mouth shut as they moved toward the street and waited for the authorities. He had so many apologies on the tip of his tongue, but they were empty, so he didn't bother trying to voice them. He kept his head down. He had done enough damage. when an awful monstrous shriek mixed with the more familiar voice crying out in pain, he was snapped out of his own self-pity. One of the creatures that had been attacking the city was there and gone in the blink of an eye, taking Midoriya with it. The hero who met them here, Burnin, was quick to follow, but the moment she let go of the hero killer, he lunged, licking blood off the ground with an awful wet slurping sound. He had no clue whose blood that had been, but it wasn't his, so he tackled the still-bound man to the ground before he had even properly gotten his feet beneath him. It was difficult to keep him in place with one functionally useless arm, but Native quickly followed, grabbing some cuffs off the ground and affixing them to the hero killer's wrists. It didn't do much to keep him in place, at least no more than the work Midoriya had already done, but it took his quirk out of the equation, which certainly eased Tenya's nerves. Between the two of them, they managed to keep him in place. He looked up to see where Todoroki had gone, and to his horror, he spotted him sprinting down the street with a fresh stab wound in his thigh. Shoto saw the Nomu coming too late to warn anyone. He tried in vain to reach for Midoriya's hand as he was ripped away from the group, but he was flying above the rooftops within seconds. The pain that had been radiating from his leg and arm became nothing but the vaguest hint of background noise as panic flooded his senses. He ran on his injured leg as if it hadn't just had a throwing knife lodged into it up to the hilt, even though he couldn't do much but watch. Midoriya was still fighting, but even if he won, he was easily 20 stories above street level. If he won, he would follow to his death. Sure enough, that's exactly what happened. The Nomu went stiff, and the two started plummeting fast. He felt the barest hint of relief when Burnin made her way to Midoriya, but their fall wasn't slowing nearly enough. So Shoto did the only thing you could think of. He stepped forward with his right foot and sent out the biggest ramp of ice that he could. It was steep, and it wasn't very smooth, but it caught them. The trio, still stuck together, rolled down the structure and landed at Shoto's feet in one piece. All exposed skin that he could see was pretty scratched up from the jagged ice, but it looked superficial for the most part. Before he could even take in the sight of them properly, Burnin lunged up with a shock of her hair in hand and plunged it into the still Nomu's brain, which sizzled and melted, leaving the smell of burnt meat lingering in the air. He knew why she did it. It was better to be safe than sorry, but it didn't make it any more pleasant to watch. After she was sure that it was taken care of, she moved to sever the claws holding Midoriya in place, which, again, wasn't very pleasant to watch. But he was safe now, and that was what mattered. But he wasn't moving. Or he was, just very sluggishly. There was a ragged wound on his side that had blood blooming out of it quickly, and he seemed dazed, like he was moving through a thick fog. His eyes were moving around without really seeing anything. Shoto knelt down next to him and put pressure on the wound, causing Midoriya to let out a pained groan. That seemed to have centered him, though, because after a few seconds, his eyes focused on Shoto and he started laughing. Why the hell was he laughing? Got a bad track record with things against my lungs, he explained with a chuckle. There was blood staining his teeth. I've got a bad track record with these things. They've got a vendetta against my lungs. Shut up, kid. This isn't funny. Don't move, laugh, or try to talk. It's only going to make it worse. Burnin barked at Midoriya before she started speaking into her comm. Send at least one ambulance and police unit to my location, stat. We have a hero student in critical condition, and Stain, the hero killer, is currently in custody. 4 others on site are injured as well, severe but not critical, Stain included. Midoriya's hand was gripped around Shoto's wrist where he was pressing into his wound as hard as he could. He was pulling at him like he was trying to move him. Midoriya, stop. You need pressure on this, he argued. He lightly tapped the stab wounds on Shoto's arms in explanation. The knives had been dislodged somewhere in the commotion, and they were bleeding a lot more than they had been because of that. Damn it, Shoto! Vernon chastised with no real heat when she realized what was going on. She quickly took his place, keeping pressure on Midoriya's ribs, and the transfer made him wince again. 5 minutes, guys. Stay with me, Jade. She updated them on what someone over the comms was saying. He felt helpless just sitting there waiting, and of all the times he did not want to see his father, this ranked pretty highly. Unfortunately, the bastard seemed to have a sixth sense for that, because here he was, thankfully with a few other heroes in tow. They took over holding Stain down from where he had apparently been struggling beneath Native and Ida, but Endeavor marched straight over to the three of them. What is going on here, Shoto? He demanded. He knew he should answer, but he could hardly think through the pain and panic. Thankfully, Vernon answered him, and Shoto just let the conversation fade into the distance as he focused on Midoriya's steady, raspy breaths. The sound of sirens approaching was the only other thing he kept an ear out for. End of chapter.